Rose stood on the dimly lit roadside, her breath forming clouds in the chilly night air. Her car had sputtered to a stop, the bonnet open as she fumbled with the engine. Darkness stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, interrupted only by flickering streetlights that threatened to die at any moment. She muttered a prayer under her breath, willing the engine to roar back to life. It didn't. A rustling sound caught her attention. Rose's heart raced as she glanced up. Her eyes met a pair of wild, piercing ones, the madman she often pitied. She had given him snacks and food whenever she drove by during the day, but tonight, she had nothing to offer. He stood a few feet away, unmoving, his gaze unsettling in the dim light. Rose forced a smile, hoping to diffuse the tension. "Go now," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. "I don't have anything tonight." The madman didn't move. A chill crept up her spine as his lips curled into a strange grin. The hairs on her neck stood on edge. Her heart thudded violently in her chest. "I said go!" Rose's voice cracked. She waved her hand dismissively, but dread already clung to her like a second skin. Before she could react, the man lunged at her. His grip was iron strong. Rose screamed, the sound ripping from her throat and echoing into the desolate night. She kicked and struggled as he dragged her off the road and into the thick undergrowth. "Help!" she shrieked, clawing at the earth. Her pleas dissolved into the night without an answer. The darkness swallowed them whole, her voice fading with the rustling leaves. Rose was a woman blessed with a melodic voice that seemed to touch the heavens. In the Living Word Church of Christ, her singing was more than just music, it was a spiritual experience. People filled the pews not only to hear the sermons, but to let Rose's angelic voice soothe their souls and draw them closer to God. Her hymns had a way of making burdens feel lighter and hope seem within reach. Among those captivated by her voice was Assistant Pastor Daniel, a young, charismatic man with a deep love for God. Daniel was admired by many in the church. Despite his position and the countless admirers he attracted, Daniel had never found the right woman to share his life and ministry with until he met Rose. Her graceful demeanor and devotion to God intrigued him. Daniel admired her strength and humility, and as days turned into weeks, admiration blossomed into love. After much prayer and contemplation, he decided to confess his feelings. One Sunday afternoon after service, Daniel found Rose by the church garden, her face radiant under the soft glow of the sun. "Rose," he began, his voice steady but laced with nervousness, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you. I admire your dedication to God and the way your voice lifts the congregation. But more than that, I've come to care for you deeply. I believe God has placed you in my life for a reason. Will you consider praying about a future with me?" Rose was taken aback. She had always respected Daniel as a leader and a man of God, but she had never imagined that he would see her as more than a choir member. After a moment of silence, she smiled softly. "I'll pray about it," she said. After weeks of prayer and seeking counsel, Rose felt peace about Daniel's proposal. They began a courtship marked by mutual respect, shared prayers, and a deepening bond. Their love blossomed, and soon Daniel asked for her hand in marriage. The church rejoiced at the announcement of their union. The wedding was a grand celebration, filled with joy and heartfelt blessings. Members of the Living Word Church of Christ sang praises, and tears filled many eyes as Rose walked down the aisle, her voice echoing through the sanctuary in a song of worship. Following the church's doctrine, it was customary for an assistant pastor to be transferred to a branch as the main pastor once he got married. Shortly after their wedding, Daniel received the official letter assigning him to a new branch in a neighboring town. The news was met with mixed emotions. While they were excited about the new chapter in their lives, they also felt a pang of sadness leaving the familiar faces of their home church. However, they embraced the change with faith, trusting that God had great plans for them. Upon their arrival at the new town, the congregation welcomed them warmly. The church council had already informed the members that their new pastor had recently wedded. There was an air of excitement and curiosity as they gathered to meet the couple. "Welcome, Pastor Daniel and Sister Rose," one of the elders said, beaming with joy. "We have heard so much about you. May God use you mightily in this branch." "Amen," Daniel responded, his heart swelling with gratitude. The congregation's admiration grew with each service. Daniel's sermons were profound yet simple, filled with wisdom and parables that made the teachings of Christ relatable. He had a way of breaking down complex scriptures into digestible truths that touched the hearts of many. Rose, on the other hand, continued to enchant the congregation with her voice. Her songs were more than melodies. They were prayers that resonated deeply within the souls of the listeners. Many testified that her voice had drawn them closer to God and even led them to repentance. Each time Rose drove past the lonely, dusty road on her way back from church or the market, she saw him, the madman with tangled hair and clothes that hung on his frail frame like rags. His bare feet were caked with dirt, and his wild eyes carried the haunted look of a man long forgotten by society. Most drivers sped past him, fearing his erratic movements, but Rose's heart was different. Compassion ruled her actions, and she could not turn a blind eye. Whenever she spotted him, she would slow down, roll down her window, and call out to him. "Here, take this," she would say gently, extending a loaf of bread or a pack of snacks she kept in her car for moments like this. The madman never spoke, but his hollow eyes would soften as he accepted the food with a trembling hand. Rose watched him shuffle away to find a secluded spot to eat. Her heart would swell with a sense of fulfillment. To Rose, this small act was a way of living out her faith. It wasn't enough to sing in church and be admired for her voice. She believed that serving God extended beyond the church walls. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Daniel brought up her encounters with the madman. "Rose, I need to talk to you about something," he began cautiously. She looked up from the Bible she was reading. "What is it?" "It's about that man you keep giving food to on the lonely road." Rose sighed. "Daniel, he's hungry and abandoned. What do you expect me to do? Drive past and pretend I didn't see him?" "I understand that you're compassionate," Daniel said, choosing his words carefully. "But that man is unpredictable. He's mentally unstable, and it's not safe for you to keep stopping there, especially when you're alone." Rose's eyes softened. "I appreciate your concern, but Jesus didn't only minister to those who were safe or predictable. He touched lepers and spoke to outcasts. If I claim to be doing the work of the Lord, I can't choose who deserves kindness and who doesn't." Daniel frowned. "There's a difference between compassion and putting yourself in harm's way. I'm just worried about your safety. What if one day he gets violent?" Rose reached for his hand. "I hear you, Daniel, but I also trust that God will protect me. Until then, I can't ignore someone who clearly needs help." Daniel knew his wife was strong-willed, especially when it came to her faith. Despite his reservations, he chose not to push the matter further. In his heart, however, a gnawing unease remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that Rose's encounters with the madman might one day bring unintended consequences. Rose, however, continued her gesture of kindness, convinced that even this simple act was part of her calling as a servant of God. Outside the church, Daniel and his wife Rose struggled with a heavy burden 5 years of marriage without a child. While they put up a united front in the community, the tension within their home was palpable. Despite Daniel's reassuring words and constant support, Rose couldn't ignore the whispers and judgment from society. One afternoon, Daniel's mother arrived unexpectedly, dragging along his outspoken sister. They barged into the living room without pleasantries. The air grew tense as Daniel's mother launched into a tirade, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Is it just to sing in the church like a nightingale?" she yelled, eyes blazing. "What good is it if you can't even bear a child for my son?" Her daughter chimed in with equal venom. "Other women are giving their husbands children. What exactly are you doing here?" The harsh words stung Rose deeply, each insult a reminder of her perceived failure. Her heart raced, and tears threatened to spill, but she held them back, determined not to break down in front of them. Daniel stormed into the room, his face a mask of fury. "That's enough, Mama," he roared, standing protectively in front of his wife. "Rose is my wife, and I won't have you disrespecting her in our home. Children come when God says it's time." His mother scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Time? How much more time do you think you have? You're not getting any younger, Daniel." Despite the chaos, Daniel held his ground. After several heated exchanges, his mother and sister finally stormed out, muttering their disapproval under their breaths. As the door slammed shut, silence settled in the room. Rose sank onto the couch, her composure unraveling. Daniel sat beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Don't listen to them," he said softly. "We'll get through this together. Time is the best healer." Rose wanted to believe him, but the weight of the insults lingered. Her love for Daniel was unwavering, but the mounting pressure was beginning to take its toll. Still, his unwavering support was the only anchor keeping her afloat amid the storm. She resolved to stay strong, hoping that someday the tides would turn in their favor. Daniel took her hand in his. "Rose, you are more than enough for me. We made a covenant before God, and I will always stand by you. Don't let their opinions steal your joy." Despite the challenges at home, Daniel and Rose remained steadfast in their ministry. They continued to pour their hearts into the church, winning souls for Christ and building a strong spiritual foundation for their congregation. The hospital's waiting room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Rose sat beside Daniel, clutching his hand tightly as they waited for the doctor's verdict. Despite their efforts to remain calm, their hearts raced with anxiety. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor finally walked in, a kind smile on his face. "Pastor Daniel, Sister Rose," he began, "I'm pleased to inform you that all your test results are normal. There is no medical reason why you can't conceive." Relief washed over Daniel's face, and he turned to Rose, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. Rose forced a smile, but inside her heart was heavy. If there was no medical issue, then what was wrong? Why had God not answered their prayers? As they left the hospital, Rose's thoughts swirled. The doctor's words should have been a source of comfort, but instead, they left her with even more questions. That evening, Rose sat quietly in the living room, her eyes fixed on the flickering candle on the table. Daniel noticed her pensive mood and moved closer, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. "Rose, what's wrong?" he asked gently. She sighed deeply. "Daniel, the doctor said we're both fine. So what is the issue? Why is God silent? Is it something I did? Is he punishing me for my past?" Her voice trembled as tears filled her eyes. Daniel's heart ached at her pain. He pulled her into a warm embrace. "No, Rose, don't think like that. God is not punishing us. We have to keep our faith strong. Since the hospital has confirmed we're fit to have children, we will continue to fast and pray. God will change our story." "But the church is already talking," Rose whispered. "People are saying that you, the pastor who heals and saves others, cannot save your own family. They are even accusing me of damaging my womb when I was young, saying I was flirting with men and now I'm suffering you, an innocent man." Her voice broke with emotion. Daniel clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Don't listen to those rumors. People will always talk, but their words mean nothing compared to what God has planned for us. We are in this together, Rose. I love you, and I will always stand by you." Rose nodded, though the pain lingered in her heart. She knew Daniel meant every word, but the whispers from the church community were relentless. Rose had always been the dutiful daughter. When her mother called and asked her to visit, she didn't hesitate. Though her mother's requests were often rooted in old traditions that Rose wasn't sure she fully believed in, she knew better than to question them. Family was everything, and this time, her mother had asked her to visit the herbalista woman renowned in the village for her supposed ability to help women conceive. The drive from her home to her mother's village was long, but Rose didn't mind. The rhythmic hum of the car engine gave her time to think. Thoughts of her marriage to Daniel lingered in her mind. For years, they had been trying to have a child, but despite all their efforts, nothing had worked. It was a silent strain that hung between them, unspoken but always there. Daniel never blamed her, but Rose couldn't help but feel the weight of her perceived failure. As she pulled into the village, the familiar sight of her mother's small house brought a sense of comfort. Her mother had always been a woman of tradition, steeped in the beliefs of their ancestors. Rose respected her, but she was never entirely sure if she truly believed in the powers of herbal remedies. Still, she was willing to give it a chance. When she arrived, her mother greeted her with a warm embrace, leading her inside to a small sitting room where the herbalist was already waiting. The woman, older than Rose's mother by a few years, had a serene presence about her. Her skin was dark and smooth, and her eyes held a kind yet knowing gaze. "Sit, my child," the herbalist instructed softly as Rose took a seat across from her. Her mother sat beside Rose, her hands folded in her lap. "She's the one who helped many women in this village. She has a gift," her mother explained, her voice filled with pride. Rose gave a hesitant smile and nodded. The herbalist took her time examining Rose, asking questions about her health, her menstrual cycle, and her relationship with Daniel. Then, the woman disappeared into the back of the house and returned with a bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth. "These will help you," the herbalist said, her voice gentle but firm. "They have been passed down for generations. They will help you conceive." She placed the herbs into Rose's hands with a soft smile. "You must take them as I have instructed. The remedy will take time, but it will work." Rose nodded, clutching the bundle tightly in her hands. She felt a flicker of hope, though a small part of her remained uncertain. But her mother's reassurances made it hard to argue. Later, after a quiet dinner with her mother, Rose thanked the herbalist and prepared to leave. It was getting late, and she needed to return to her own home to fulfill her duties. Daniel had traveled for work, and Rose was expected to stand in for him during the Sunday service the next morning. It wasn't ideal to be driving so late, but she was determined to get home. As she began the long drive back, the night air grew colder, and the road stretched out endlessly before her. Her mind kept drifting to the herbs and the possible future they might bring, visions of a family, a child, a life that had long felt just out of reach. Her heart yearned for that dream, even though she knew the road ahead was uncertain. But as she turned down the familiar stretch of road near the outskirts of town, her car suddenly sputtered. It was a small sound at first, a strange cough from the engine, but then it turned into something far worse. The car came to a complete stop, and Rose found herself in the middle of nowhere, her headlights flickering faintly. She cursed softly, gripping the steering wheel. This wasn't the first time her car had acted up, but she had hoped it would hold up just one more time. Rose sat there for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The road was empty, no other vehicles in sight, just the dim glow of the distant streetlights. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and popped the hood. The cold wind nipped at her skin as she leaned over the engine, trying to make sense of the issue. But no matter how hard she looked, nothing seemed out of place. She felt a sudden unease settle in her chest. It was too quiet here, too isolated. Just as she was about to close the bonnet and go back to the driver's seat, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply and saw him, a man she had often seen on the road, the one who wandered aimlessly, the so-called madman. His wild hair, his tattered clothes, and his unblinking gaze always made him an unsettling presence, but he never bothered anyone. He would simply stand there, watching her as she drove by. Tonight, though, was different. His eyes were fixed on her, and there was something in the way he stood that made her stomach churn. "Hey, you," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I don't have anything for you today. Tomorrow I'll bring you something, okay?" She tried to smile, but the unease still gnawed at her. His expression didn't change. He just stared at her with those wild eyes, the eerie calm in his demeanor sending a chill down her spine. She took a step back, instinctively moving closer to her car. "I said go," she repeated, her voice firmer now, though it trembled slightly. But the man took a step forward instead of backing away. "I don't have anything," she said again, her voice growing desperate. "I'm just trying to fix my car and go home. Please." And then, in an instant, the madman lunged forward, grabbing her with surprising strength. His hands were cold, and his grip was unrelenting. Rose screamed in shock and fear, struggling against him, but he overpowered her quickly. Her heart raced as she realized the true danger she was in. "Stop!" she cried, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the wind, her screams lost in the emptiness of the night. The man dragged her away from the car, pulling her into the thick bush on the side of the road. Rose fought back, clawing at him, but her strength was no match for his. The night swallowed her cries as he forced himself on her, his actions brutal and swift, leaving Rose in a state of shock and helplessness. When it was over, the man stood up, his expression blank as ever, and walked away, leaving her behind, broken and alone in the cold darkness. Rose lay there for what felt like an eternity, tears streaming down her face, her body sore and bruised. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How could this man, this figure she had always felt a strange pity for, do such a thing to her? Slowly, she gathered the strength to get up, her body trembling as she stumbled back to the car. She crawled into the driver's seat, her sobs uncontrollable now. The pain, both physical and emotional, overwhelmed her as she sat there in the silence, the car now a sanctuary in her mind. even though the world outside seemed so cold. She stayed there until morning, unable to leave, unable to process what had happened. A good Samaritan finally passed by and helped her get her car running again, but the road ahead felt different now. There was no returning to the woman she had been before. The vision of the herbalist's promise, the hope of motherhood, seemed so distant now, overshadowed by the darkness of the night's events. When she arrived home, the house felt like a cage. Daniel was still away, and Rose knew deep down that she would never be able to look at the world in the same way again. She was no longer just the woman hoping for a child. She was now a woman with a secret too heavy to bear alone. In the days that followed the traumatic incident, Rose began to feel a deep, growing fatigue in her body. At first, she attributed it to the stress of the past few weeks, the long hours at work, the emotional toll of seeing her mother and visiting the herbalist, and the lingering thoughts of what had happened on that dark road. Maybe it was just malaria, or perhaps it was her body telling her to slow down. She convinced herself that she was simply worn out. After all, it wasn't unusual to feel a little drained when life seemed to demand so much from her. But then, something else happened. Rose realized that she hadn't seen her monthly flow. She tried to brush it off, convincing herself that it was just another irregular cycle. But deep down, a small seed of doubt had been planted. As the days passed and the signs of fatigue didn't fade, the doubt grew. One morning, after yet another sleepless night spent tossing and turning, Rose couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to know for sure. She rushed to the nearest pharmacy and bought a pregnancy test strip, hoping it was just her mind playing tricks on her. As she sat in the small, dimly lit bathroom, the minutes seemed to stretch into eternity. The small window on the test strip began to show its results, and when the 2 red lines appeared, Rose's heart stopped. The test was positive. Her breath caught in her throat. A mixture of disbelief, fear, and confusion flooded her mind. She stared at the test in her trembling hands, her heart racing. She was pregnant, something she had longed for, but not in this way. The joy of seeing the 2 red lines was tainted by the haunting memory of the madman, his grip on her body, and the violence she had suffered at his hands. Tears welled up in her eyes as the reality of the situation set in. She thought about how she and Daniel had been trying for a child for so long, how they had prayed and hoped, but it never seemed to happen. Now, here she was pregnant, but under circumstances that felt like a cruel twist of fate. Rose buried her face in her hands, the weight of it all crashing down on her. She had never imagined her first pregnancy would come under such painful circumstances. Her thoughts spiraled. She remembered how much she wanted this child, how she had longed for the joy of motherhood, the love of a child in her arms. But now, that joy felt tainted. The thoughts of the madman kept flashing in her mind, and she wondered if anyone would ever believe the truth. She thought of Daniel, her loving husband, who had always been so kind and supportive. How would she tell him? How could she explain the circumstances of her pregnancy without tearing apart everything they had built together? Rose cried for what felt like hours. The tears flowed freely, her heart heavy with the burden of this secret she now carried. How could she live with it? How could she face Daniel with this weight on her shoulders? But then, amidst the overwhelming flood of emotions, something in her shifted. She wiped her tears, taking a deep, shaky breath. She thought of Daniel, the man who loved her, who had stood by her side through thick and thin. No matter the circumstances, she couldn't deny that this child was a part of them. The past, though painful, could not erase the love and intimacy they had shared. She and Daniel had been intimate in the months before this pregnancy, and there had been moments of deep connection between them. Maybe, just maybe, this child was a gift they had been waiting for all along, even if the journey to this point had been filled with darkness. With that realization, a quiet resolve settled in her heart. Rose decided to bury the secret deep within herself, never to speak of the madman or the violence she had endured. She would protect her marriage, protect Daniel's peace of mind, and cherish the pregnancy as a gift from God. She would carry the secret with her, locked away in the deepest corners of her soul, never to be shared with anyone. The day Daniel returned from his trip, Rose was determined to create a moment of joy. She spent the day preparing a delicious meal, one of his favorites, and wore her best dress on that had always made her feel beautiful and confident. As she set the table, she smiled through the tears that still threatened to fall. She would be strong. She would make this work. When Daniel finally walked through the door, the warmth of his smile was enough to make Rose's heart swell. His tired eyes lit up when he saw her, and he immediately pulled her into his arms. "Rose," he said softly, "you look beautiful. I missed you." "I missed you too," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. She led him to the table and they sat down to eat. As they shared the meal, the conversation flowed easily, just like it always had. They talked about his trip, the challenges he faced, and the small joys he had experienced. But Rose, in her quiet resolve, knew that there was one thing she had to say, one thing that would change their lives forever. "Daniel," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I have something to tell you." He looked up at her, his face filled with concern. "What is it, Rose?" With a deep breath, Rose smiled softly and placed a hand on her stomach. "I'm pregnant, Daniel. We're going to have a baby." Daniel's face lit up in an instant, his eyes widening with joy and disbelief. He stood up, pulling her into a tight embrace, his hands gently cradling her face. "You're pregnant?" he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "That's incredible. I don't even know what to say." Tears filled Rose's eyes once again, but this time, they were tears of joy. Daniel pulled her closer, kissing her forehead, his hands tenderly brushing away the tears on her cheeks. "I'm so happy, Rose. This is the best news I could have ever asked for. I love you." In that moment, Rose felt a flicker of peace. She had made the right choice, though the path had been long and difficult. She was going to move forward with this pregnancy, with Daniel, and with the hope of building the family they had always dreamed of. As they embraced, Rose made a silent vow to herself. She would protect this family, protect her marriage, and never speak of the darkness that had led her here. No matter what the future held, she would carry this secret in silence, burying it deep within her heart forever. Rose had given birth to a baby boy, a beautiful, healthy child, and for a while, life seemed like it was slowly returning to normal. Daniel, the man she had married, the man who had stood by her side through thick and thin, was overjoyed by the news of the birth. He was the happiest man in the world, beaming with pride as he held their son in his arms. To him, this baby was a miracle, the fulfillment of their dreams, the blessing they had longed for. But Rose, while she loved her son with all her heart, couldn't shake the feelings that still lingered in her mind. Every time she looked at the boy, every time he smiled up at her with his bright eyes, she saw the reflection of the madman, the man who had taken what was never his, the man who had violated her in the most horrific way. Her heart broke a little every time she looked at him. The resemblance to the madman was too strong to ignore. It was a cruel reminder of the night she would never forget, and no matter how much she loved her son, a part of her mind would always tie him to that dark moment. It wasn't that she didn't want her baby, she did, so desperately. She wanted to raise him, to see him grow and flourish in the love she and Daniel shared. But the guilt, the shame, the fear that she had kept such a huge secret from her husband, it was eating her up from the inside. She couldn't stand to keep carrying it alone any longer. The church celebrated the birth of their son. The congregation rejoiced with them, offering their blessings and congratulations. As the years went by, the boy grew, and with each passing day, Daniel grew more attached to him. They spent their leisure time together, telling stories, playing games, and bonding over shared moments. Daniel, ever the loving father, reveled in the simple joys of fatherhood. He took pride in his son, always encouraging him, always present for him. But Rose couldn't help but notice the striking resemblance between her son and the madman, and it gnawed at her. The boy's features, his mannerisms, everything about him seemed to mirror the stranger who had taken something from her that could never be returned. Rose had tried to bury her feelings, to push them aside, but as her son grew, so did her sense of isolation. She couldn't carry this secret any longer. She needed someone to talk to, someone who could give her the support and guidance she so desperately craved. Her mind turned to her mother. It had been a long time since they had spoken about the situation, but Rose knew that if there was anyone who might understand her pain, it was her mother. She needed to tell her mother the truth, needed to share everything that had been weighing on her heart. And so, one afternoon, while Daniel was at work, Rose called her mother. She sat in the quiet of her home, pacing the floor, as the phone rang. When her mother finally picked up, Rose felt a sense of relief wash over her. "Mom, I need to talk to you, Rose said, her voice shaking with emotion. It's about the baby, and about everything that's been going on. Her mother's voice was filled with concern as she asked, "What's wrong, Rose? Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? You know you can always talk to me." Rose explained how the boy had grown, how he looked so much like the madman who had assaulted her. She told her mother how the guilt and shame had eaten away at her, and how she couldn't live with the secret any longer. She told her mother not to tell Daniel yet, not knowing how he would react if he found out the truth. As she ended the call and turned to face the room, she froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway was Daniel, his expression unreadable. He had been listening. "Daniel," Rose whispered, panic rising in her chest. His face was cold, his eyes hard. "So, this is what you've been hiding from me all along?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. Rose took a step back, her heart racing as her mind scrambled for the right words. "Two didn't want to hurt you, Daniel. I was scared, and I—" But she was cut off as Daniel walked toward her. She backed away, her feet stumbling over the floor, until she hit the wall. She couldn't escape. Her eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she pleaded, "I'm sorry, Daniel. Please forgive me. It's my fault. I should have told you sooner." To her surprise, Daniel didn't raise his voice in anger. He didn't shout. Instead, he spoke with a calmness that was almost chilling. "You don't need to apologize, Rose. I knew from the moment you told me you were pregnant that the child wasn't mine." Rose's mind reeled. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" "I'm sorry I never told you," Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The inability to conceive wasn't your fault. It was mine. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to admit that I was the one who couldn't have children." Rose's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to process his words. "But the tests, the doctors—" Daniel lowered his head, tears streaming down his face. "I paid them, Rose. I paid the doctors to manipulate the results. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you, of you finding out the truth. But I knew from the beginning that the child wasn't mine. I've always known." Rose's eyes widened in disbelief. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had been hidden from her. "But why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you trust me with the truth?" "I thought maybe God would intervene. I prayed and hoped, but I was ashamed of what I had done in the past," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "When I was in university, I made mistakes. I flirted with so many girls, and I contracted a dangerous infection that almost killed me. When I recovered, the doctors told me I would never be able to have children. I was devastated. I cried for months, but then I gave my life to Christ. I decided to serve God, and I hoped that somehow He would answer my prayers, but I never thought this would happen." Rose was speechless, the flood of emotions overwhelming her. All the years of prayer, fasting, and sacrifices, not knowing the truth that had been kept from her. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders, and she could barely stand. Daniel knelt on the floor, tears in his eyes as he looked up at her. "Please, Rose, I love you. I love our son. I don't care about the circumstances. I want to be his father. I will raise him with all the love I have. Please forgive me." Rose didn't know what to say. The man she had loved, the man who had been her rock, had kept a secret from her that had changed everything. She couldn't process the emotions swirling in her mind. The years of doubt, the accusations, the pain of it felt like it had been a lie. Unable to speak, Rose turned and left the room, her heart heavy. She got into her car and drove, not knowing where she was going or what she was searching for. Tears flowed down her cheeks, the road ahead uncertain. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: everything had changed. If you were Rose's friend, what would you say to her? Should she forgive or move on from it all? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and keep an eye out for part 2.